Good morning, everybody, and thanks for patiently waiting. So today we're going to do the assignment discussion, for the unit 2, which is internally show the quality of assessment. Now, as I mentioned earlier in some of the lectures, that this is a practical unit. Most of the, if you see the learning outcome and assessment grade, most of the learning outcomes are be able to. There is nothing in terms of to understand or knowledge related. So here you have to practically demonstrate the activities that you do on a day in day out basis in your IQA role. Now there is a bit of a scenario which is given, which briefly explains what is expected in the assignment. So this scenario basically talks about your role as an IQA within the organization, and it basically refers to the fact that if you are working as an IQA within the organization, then you are required to monitor, assess activities which will allow you to follow the quality guidance which are given, or quality guidelines which are primarily given for the qualification, or say for example for any particular course that is being run. Now in this particular role that you perform, what you're expected to do is that you are expected to show that you are at least managing two assessors, and you should have access to two assessors, and each assessor should have access to two learners' work. This would be something which will be required for you to be able to evidence and start creating the evidence for the activities which are listed down here as bullet points. So a must requirement here would be, in order for you to generate the evidence for the IQA monitoring activities, you need to have at least two assessors, and each of the assessors' work should be available to you. And along with the assessors' work, you should also have, because you are going to be primarily looking at passing judgments or agreeing with the judgments of assessors, then you also need to have access to learners' work. So each assessor, that say, for example, if we say hypothetically, Shazia has Yasir and say Anjum as an assessor, then Yasir should be able to provide you two learners' work, and Anjum should be able to provide you two learners' work. If you look at Amrita, you have two assessors like Harpreet and Gagan. Then in that case, you should have access to Harpreet's work, and you should have access to Gagan's work. If I look at Reena, in that case, say for example, if you have two assessors, you have say Victor, and for example, you have Dr. Anita, then in such cases, you should have access to their work, because you would be required to bring that as evidence into annexures in your assignment. So this particular unit would probably have a written evidence in the form of essays and verbatim, which will primarily mean that you're basically explaining some of the tasks and activities in as per the assessment criteria. But at the same time, what you're also going to be doing is adding a lot of annexures to the end of your document or end of your evidence, which will primarily showcase and cross-reference that this is how I practically, say for example, or practically demonstrates this is how you carry out the planning and monitoring activities. So the assignment brief is not quite helpful. So what I've done here is I've broken down the assignment brief into a presentation, because each of these points you need to know what you need to address. Although they are all addressing all these assessment criteria, what they've very casually done is basically just listed some of these assessment criteria and under the scenario which has been given here. But what you would need to do is evidence, and you would need to understand, and that's the point of discussion in today's session, is that what is the evidence that you need to bring in to hit all these assessment criteria which are given in the assignment brief. So in the end, what they've done is very casually again mentioned what is the summary and submission format. So for example, here it requires a portfolio of evidence. Now, portfolio of evidence is what we want to go into in each of the bullet points. It requires evidence of IQA monitoring activities for two assessors. That is where you would need to have at least the evidence to show that you are managing two assessors. And then there is a reflective account, which is more or less like a small essay, which basically looks at reflection on your IQA activities and how do you develop your knowledge and skills in the IQA role. This will be a small essay which will address learning outcome 5, predominantly given here. And then observation of performance, which is sometimes when you give feedback to assessors. There are obviously work products, for example, sign-up forms, which are IQA sheets. there could be sampling plans, and then in some cases you have observation reports that you write for learners when they do presentations, and how do you give feedback and how do you agree or concur with that assessment feedback with the assessors is something that you would need to evidence. So there is a lot more that you would need to bring in to cover these particular tasks, and it is a I would suggest that it will be a good exam, good I would say practice to start with getting together this evidence in place before you even start writing the assignment. Simply because if you have the evidence, then you need to write a bit of verbatim to explain what this is and how do you apply or use that as a particular document in carrying out your IQA activities. So that's the bit that I would want you to look at, especially, for this particular unit. And this assignment, if I put it across this way, that the assignment might be, when you start writing the assignment, it might be 8 to 10 pages in terms of write up. But when you start adding the annexures and the, let's say, the evidence, let's say the examples of, I would say, documents that to evidence what you've theoretically written in the assignment, this assignment would bloat up to, about maybe I would say 40-50 pages. It could be up to 30-35 pages, but depending on how detailed you want to do it, because this at some stage is going to be, hopefully you'll end up creating a very detailed document or a Bible which you can use on a day-to-day basis when you carry out or do an IQA role within an institution or a center. So some learners choose to do this in a lot of detail simply because they are looking at compiling this together as a ready reference or as a ready reference document which they can use when they get into the IQA role or when they are in a bigger institution, or say, for example, in a particular location wherein they can implement this in a fuller scale as compared to sometimes when you are required to do limited set of activities depending on the size and scale of the organization. So some of the very specific, bits that I would mention in this is that I would suggest that you write an introduction about the chosen organization, which you are looking at, in terms of, say, for example, a hypothetical or a chosen organization that you're using for the description of the assignment. And that would, and in the beginning itself, I would suggest that you define what are the evidences that you are going to fall back onto to be able to, do this particular assignment. So I would start off with, say, just as an example, that I've chosen UK Versity as an organization. You might choose a fictitious organization, and you would say that, okay, in terms of doing this assignment, in terms of compiling the evidence for this particular assignment, and to showcase my role as an IQA, I have in which I plan and monitor and implement some of the activities related to my role. I have considered the following documents which are useful for providing the portfolio, which are going to be useful for, let's say, evidencing the work, and this is being done in order to showcase the plan monitoring activities and feedback that I provide to assessors. And then you list down the types of documents that you're going to be using. So I would list down the type of documents, things like I'll start with policies and procedures which are related to the IQA role, assessment role. I would start with, putting together some of the documents so in this case you're just listing it out as a table of contents. So start with policies, procedures, start with standardization meeting, teaching observations, IQA interim and final plans, assessment plans, look at a CPD plan for the organization, look at external trainings that you go out and attend, and in some cases mention the assessors work and the learner work anonymized to say that these are the evidence or documents that I'll be using as evidence in compiling and preparing the assignment for this particular unit. And then we get into some of the activities which are required for the assignment in order to get into the guidance and obviously the assignment activities which have been given for this particular unit. Don't forget to fill up the cover sheet, which will be required, which is there on Moodle. So that's the cover sheet that you would be required to fill. And if we go down into now the individual activities that we are required to do, in your role as an IQA. So what I would suggest here is that you would first sit down and obviously write down and gather evidence from the two assessors and the two learners or four learners essentially for which you should have the work at hand. And there could be assignments coming in from ATHE, OTHM, Pearson, anything that you've marked and, obviously done assessments of as assessors can be used by anonymizing them for the evidence that you will, use for the task. So let's start with the first task. These are the tasks that are listed in the assignment brief. So I've just put them here. But let's start with the first task in terms of understanding what are the planning and monitoring activities that you do in meeting the requirements of your role. So here, if I look at the first assessment criteria, which is 1.1, you're expected to describe your own role in the organization, and you're expected to I would say summarize by listing down the documents that you're going to be using or you use in your role to plan and monitor the IQA role activities. So these documents could be documents which are drawn up at the start of the academic year. These documents tend to be, some of them you draw them up, some of them are drawn up by your assessors team or assessors in your team. And that would mean things like you could also have documents like a program review document. You could have an assessment plan for the year. You could base the assessment planning, which has been done by your assessors. You would draw up your IQA interim and final plans. You would create a calendar or at least a sketch or a print of meetings that you would probably run throughout the year, which could mean there could be minutes of the basically meetings with the staff, which could be looking at termly meetings. There could be standardization meetings. These could also be looking at documents that you refer to, which are external documents from external quality assurance from various awarding organizations, handbooks or course handbooks essentially, and they would essentially be the set of activities that you plan to run your activities in the IQA role. So here, the main purpose would be you might send out emails in terms of communication, and they could also be evidenced, as one of the activities that you do in order to keep your team and the team of assessors updated on any changes which are coming across in the qualification. So keeping track of newsletters, updates coming in from awarding bodies, discussions with external quality examiners for fixing up or scheduling the dates for visit. All these would form a part and parcel of your activities that you carry out in your IQA role. And this is what you would need to evidence. So you might not need to evidence everything, but it will be good that if you are able to document some of these by describing your role within the organization and then listing some of these documents in the annexure to say, okay, this is how I send an email at the start of the year to discuss the dates for visits with the EQA or the external examiner. This is how I set out the plan for the year in terms of IQA, wherein it consists of things like, drawing up an assessment plan and working on the assessment plan to create a sampling plan, interim and final for the IQA activity. And then some of the other activities which are run termly, 6 monthly in the institution, they could be listed out in the form of a table. And that would be something which would cover task 1.1. Is that okay? I think what you are looking at noting down here would be basically the set of evidence which is required primarily, to be able, set of evidence that is required for you to be able to plan and then document when you, obviously start doing and writing out these tasks. The next particular assessment criteria talks about making arrangements for internal monitoring activities. Now here the key word is monitoring. So how do you look at your role wherein you look at monitoring activities? What are these monitoring activities? These monitoring activities are looking at whether the teaching schedule or the teaching and delivery schedule is happening as planned, which is as per the timetable which has been set within the organization for teaching. That could be one such monitoring activity. The second monitoring activity would be, are the assessments happening on time? Is the release of assignments happening on time to the students? Because in most organizations, you normally have an assignment release date and you have an assignment submission date. So you'll be looking at those activities which are going to be related to assessment side of things. Then you would also be looking at any sort of communication and meetings which are happening across the academic year, and they would be relating to either program specifications or changes which are introduced by awarding bodies at times, or in some cases, these communications would primarily be done to ensure that you are able to carry out your IQA activity. That means your sampling of the assessments which have been received so far and assessments basically done by the assessors. So, release of assignment brief could be one such internal monitoring activity wherein you are expected to sign off the assignment briefs to say they are fit for purpose, they have a detailed vocational scenario, and the evidence which has been asked for in the assignment brief is fit for purpose, and that will allow learners to be able to achieve the desired grades in that particular unit or module. You could look out and obviously list out documents like an interim sampling plan or a schedule that you share with your assessors, and that would give them a clear idea in terms of, okay, if the assignment submissions are happening towards the end of this month, then within the next 2 weeks you'll be looking at carrying out interim sampling on the assessments which have been done by the assessors. And then if you draw up a calendar of meetings or standardization meetings or teaching observations wherein you are directly involved, then they would be the set of internal monitoring activities that you would document in this particular application, or in this particular, I would say, assessment criteria. Now, the next one talks about carrying out internal monitoring activities to look at quality requirements. Now, as an IQA in the organization, you're required to carry some monitoring activities which depict that the center or the institution is actually meeting the quality requirements. Now, what are these internal monitoring activities that you carry out on behalf of the awarding organization or an external organization? Because IQAs are generally seen as eyes and ears of the external examiner or external quality assurer within the center or within a particular organization. So there are a set of certain monitoring activities that you carry out, which is to ensure that the center, college, institution, university, or whatever the setup is, training company, they are meeting the quality requirements which are specified in the program handbook or the awarding body guidelines with regards to running a qualification within a particular setup. Now, what are they related to? These are related to policies and procedures. So when you look at an awarding organization, they generally refer to about 13 different quality policies, which essentially, conform to ensuring that the organization has the 4 pillars which are required within the setup to be able to run and offer that qualification to learners. What are these pillars? These pillars include quality assurance. These pillars include teaching and delivery. They include administration and operation. And last but not the least, anything related to business development, recruitment, or recruitment of learners. Now, what we don't want to be able to do is basically cover the 4 aspects. What we want to do is focus on the quality assurance part of it. So the quality assurance part of it, out of these 13 policies, includes things like malpractice policy, it includes plagiarism policy, it includes data protection policy, it includes equality and diversity policy, it includes whistleblowing policy, it includes conflict of interest policy, it includes policies which are related to assessment and internal quality assurance, teaching strategy or policy if it is there within the organization. Now, these are the set of policies that you want to see as an IQA being implemented in the organization. And if these policies are implemented within the organization, then they would help you meet some of the quality requirements which are required to be monitored and obviously, implemented within a particular setup or an organization. So here you have to talk about the internal monitoring activities that you do on the basis of quality policies which have been implemented within the organization. Now, there are 13 such policies, but you could pick out a few to carry out and show how they are put into practice. Now, one of the things that I do as an IQA in the role as an IQA is that I also look at, apart from assessments, I also look at plagiarism and AI detection, software and policy. So we want to see whether the assessors are looking at, the implementation of the plagiarism policy, AI and malpractice policy, and are the policies of the organization set up in such a way that they have defined limits? And then if if an occurrence of malpractice does happen, then how is that policy and procedure actually depicting or giving out guidance which the assessors, students, and the institution needs to follow in order to, let's say, reach a particular solution or mitigate that particular circumstance. And in such cases, you would use and show that policy, how it is put into work, or put into action. And that is the set of activities that you carry out in terms of ensuring that the quality standards are maintained within the organization. So this task would require you to have evidence of access to policies, and then the implementation of those policies and your role in the implementation of those policies would need to be explained, because that is where it shows that how you use the policies and procedures set within the organization to ensure that the quality and quality standards are maintained in accordance with the requirements of awarding body guidelines. The next assessment criteria talks about evaluating planning and preparation for assessment processes. So here, what we have to look at is the bit which was mentioned in the initial, scenario of the assignment, is that you need to, in order to provide evidence for IQA monitoring activities, you need to have access to at least 2 assessors. So this part of the task primarily looks at you having access to that particular assessor's work. And in such cases, here the requirement for the task would be to look at talking about how do you manage the assessing team, and what is the planning that you do in terms of preparation for the assessment process. So you should have access to an assessment plan for a particular course or a qualification. You should be able to then, on the basis of that assessment plan, create a sampling plan and provide that sampling plan to the assessors. And here you need to talk about how do you give individual feedback in the process of planning and preparation of the processes to assessors, so that the assessments that they do for learners, that means marking of assignments they do, or for example, observation of practice they do for learners, in such cases that is secure, reliable, compliant, fair, and consistent. So here the idea would be to look at talking about the process of assessment within the organization, but in order to showcase and theoretically talk about the process, but also show the application of that process, you would need to show and document an assessment plan for a particular unit or a particular course, and then how that assessment plan is used by you to further plan your IQA activities to ensure that the assessments which are done are reliable, they are done on time, they are fair, they are consistent. And then when the IQA activity is carried out, it confirms the assessments and the judgments given on the assessments, and that allows learners to progress in the course. So this bit would need to be, obviously done from a point of view of looking at ensuring that you are having the access to the assessment plan in order to complete this particular task. Now, task 2.3 is also related to assessments. It talks about how do you determine whether the assessment methods are safe, fair, valid, and reliable. Now, one of the things that I've shown previously in the assignment briefs that we have created is that in some cases we create those briefs, in some cases we end up, I would put it this way, using the assignment briefs which are provided by the awarding organizations. Now, in cases wherein we prepare the assignment briefs, what we have to look at is that the assignment briefs that are prepared are fit for purpose. Now, when I say fit for purpose, what I mean by that is that they allow the learners to be able to, let's say, not just gain knowledge, but also allow them to exercise the skills that they have developed during the study of that unit, and that as an output needs to be brought out in the assignment. So the evidence that sometimes has to be compiled via the assignment brief has to be done in such a way that it allows the learners to show what they have learned and what they have learned by producing evidence which is commensurate to that particular requirement of that unit. Now, just as a case in point, because in some cases we do not develop the assignment briefs, but we use the assignment briefs. In your case, you're going to do the Unit 2 assignment brief. Now, this is an assignment brief that I've developed, which is primarily for a unit in Pearson BTech program. Now, here, if you see, there are certain requirements whether which the IQA has to go through and see whether the assignment brief is fit for purpose and is it valid in terms of addressing all the assessment criteria and learning outcomes. Is it supporting holistic assessment? Is the evidence which is being required to be produced from the learners by doing this assignment, is it going to be safe? Is it going to be reliable? Is it going to be useful at the end of the day in terms of helping the learner gain knowledge and obviously develop skills? So that has to be taken into account. So here, in order to do this particular task, you have to look at referencing what are called the VASCAR principles of assessment, which means the assessments that are being designed in the assignment and given to the learners are valid, authentic, sufficient, current, reliable, and they are fair and do not provide, they are fair and reliable and do not provide, say, for example, let's say an unfair advantage to some learners to be able to score or better their grades. So if I look at the assignment brief, it talks about the introduction to the unit. There is some journal information given to the students from where they can essentially get or compile, start looking at sources or research areas from where they can start compiling the evidence. A very clear guidance is given on the submission format of the assignment. So the submission format of the assignment clearly says it's a Word document report, and it covers covers and hits the LO1, 2, and 3 assessment criteria. Obviously, it also needs to specify referencing systems. So in the case of Pearson, we are following Harvard referencing system. You give a bit of a steer in terms of signposting, plagiarism, and collusion. You give a list of reading and resources which the students can refer to. You are clearly referencing in the assignment brief, which the assessors are creating, that it is referencing which LOs and assessment criteria. So it covers LO1, 2, and 3. Then there is a sufficient enough scenario which allows learners to understand why these activities are being asked to be done. So there's this vocational scenario which has been given, and each of the activities are then clearly planned out in a way wherein it tells them very clearly that they are hitting these assessment criteria when they do these kind of activities basis the scenario. And then towards the end, you give them a guidance in terms of, so for example, in this case, it is 3,000 words. And if I look at plus minus 3,000, it is 2,700 to say 3,300, words that they can, produce in terms of assignment. Now, because Pearson has implemented quality code, so obviously there is a word limit on the assignments, and you're allowed to go plus minus 10% on that word limit. And then towards the end, you also provide the assessment grid, which the learners can refer to say, okay, these are the criteria which they are being referred to when they look at, doing the assignment. Now, this assignment brief has to be signed off by the IQA. And this is to ensure that, yes, the assignment brief as a document is detailed enough. It talks about and provides relevant and background information to the learners to say that why this assignment brief, is fit for purpose. And in most cases, it will also give the learners a very clear idea in terms of what is the output that they need to produce, how the output or evidence that they create is going to be graded, what assessment criteria they're hitting, and it has an issue date and a submission date, which means that learners should be able to submit the assignment within that date. You as an IQA look into the aspect of not that there is an issue and submission date. You want to see is there sufficient time available to learners to be able to do their research, compile their evidence, and then present or submit the assignment. So as you can see, there is a clear 35 or 5 weeks available within this particular date to be able to submit the assignment. There are clear guidelines which are given, and those are the bits that you have to look at in determining whether the assessments are valid, they are fair, and obviously they are meeting the requirements set by the awarding body in terms of helping the learners meet that requirement. So if I take you back to the presentation here, this is one such example of how you would look at determining whether the assessment methods are safe, fair, valid, and reliable. Now, when you look at the learning outcomes as an IQA, learning outcome 1, 2, and 3, high performance, work, and culture, is the assessment method of Word document report valid? Is it going to be, is it that a PowerPoint presentation would have been more suitable, or a group activity would have been more suitable? Or in some cases, you define and look into and go into details of finding out whether the activity or the output in which the evidence has been asked for, is it suitable for the learners to be able to produce? So in such cases, you would need to clearly look at that, whether there is clear guidance given to the learner to, in some cases, maybe a template or a templated document provided for the learners to be able to produce that evidence. And that is what you need to cover when you look at, the assessment criteria 2.3, which talks about determining whether the assessment methods are, safe, fair, valid, and reliable. So here you would probably discuss the VASCAR model and then evidence one such particular criteria of how do you determine that the assessments which are being designed for a particular unit are meeting the requirements of the awarding body guidelines and also helping the learners achieve, the grade and the unit by completing and compiling that evidence. The next one talks about whether the assessment decisions are being made using the specified criteria. Now here, I would give you an example that sometimes when we look at the assignment briefs, which are given by awarding organizations, or in assignment briefs which are essentially used for the purposes of evaluation and assessment, what we need to be able to see in these assignment briefs is that are the assignment briefs fit for purpose? Are they essentially hitting all the assessment requirements or decisions which are there? When I say assessment requirements, I mean assessment criteria which are there primarily to address, let me rephrase. So here, what you have to do is you have to look at the assignment brief and the tasks which have been set in the assignment brief. And are the tasks then hitting the specified assessment criteria given in the assignment brief or the guidelines, or in the course handbook guidelines, provided by the awarding body? So again, if I show you an example here, what you would need to do is refer to the camera technique, which is one of the techniques that we use in, looking at making assessment decisions. So you, as an IQA, sometimes when we do the IQA role, what we do is we look at every time we look at covering all the assessors, all the learners across all the units to ensure, and if there are multiple sites for the college or for the institution, then you also look at covering the assessors and the learners across the various sites. Now, as an IQA, you're also required to ensure that you are covering all different forms of assessments if they have been defined, for a particular unit in doing that assignment. So, for example, in some cases, when we have different assignment briefs or parts of the assignment brief for a particular unit, sometimes you would see that the first part talks about word report, second part talks about a reflective essay, or in some cases, the third part talks about, a PowerPoint presentation. So what you're looking at is you're covering the methods of assessment as well. So in this particular task, which talks about determining assessment decisions and are they made using a specified criteria, so you look at the camera technique wherein you cover all the candidates, all the assessors, all the methods of assessment. You look at different types of records, and you look at even different assessment sites if there are branches or different locations of colleges or universities. Now, what you see on my screen is an assignment brief, and what as an IQA, what I need to look at is, are my assessors going to be looking at the assessment decisions guidelines which are given to be able to identify those specified criteria? So here, if I look at task 1, there's a bit of a scenario which is given. If I look at task 1, there are 4 tasks in task 1, which each are hitting the assessment criteria 1.1, 1.2, 2.1, and 2.2. Now, how do I know that the assessments that my assessors are doing are actually hitting the assessment criteria. So what I do is if I scroll down to the back of the assignment brief, what it gives is a bit of a guidance in some cases to say what you would as assessors need to look at when you look at the evidence of the learner, and identify that evidence and relate it to the assessment criteria. So in this case, when I look at LO1, it has two assessment criteria. So you are required to look at, say for example, when completing individual tasks, learners are required to consider professional behavior and ethics. They are required to look at talking about compliance and accounting standards, ethical requirements, consequences of non-compliance, and consequences of unethical behavior. Now, if these are met, then your learning outcome assessment criteria 1.1 and 1.2 are met. So in your case, when you assess this work, when you look at the assessed work from the assessor and you start looking at doing the IQ activity, what you're going to look at is whether the assessor has clearly identified this evidence and annotated comments. So first part is, have they identified the AC? Second is, have they justified by their commenting that the AC has been achieved? And the third is their judgment on the achievement of that AC justified by the reason that they have given? So these are the three things that you would be looking at as an IQA in the work. And that is where, again, going back to the initial part, you need to have access to two assessors and have the assessors at least have access to two of the learners per assessor, which will allow you to complete this particular part of the task. So here you would look at the assessment decision, whether the assessor has identified the AC, justified the achievement of that AC, and then overall you would look at the grade which the assessor has given by to the learner who has completed and submitted the assignment. And in doing so, you would refer theoretically to the camera technique in assessment and then evidence the assignment brief, which will go in the annexure, and the assessment front cover sheet, which will show the assessment decisions. And then on top of it, you would have your IQA sheet, which will essentially say that why this particular decision is what you agree to, and why do you agree with this particular grade. So in such cases, you would need to evidence very clearly these three documents, which would then allow you to, I would say, complete this particular part of the task. So if I give you a simple example, and if I look at, how this would be evidenced by adding the documents would be in the annexure, you would probably produce an IQA report, and that IQA report would be for a particular learner. It will say why you're agreeing with the assessor decision, and essentially why and how you've gone about using the camera technique to check on the assessment decisions, that they are covering all the candidates, they are all covering all the assessors. Obviously, the decisions are valid, and there is clear evidence that you've put in to show that this particular decision taken by the assessor is correct and is accurate. So that will allow you to achieve task 2.4. Any questions on this so far?
Nothing from me.
So if I look at the next one, which basically says, how do you compare assessor decision to ensure they are consistent? Now, here is where you would need to evidence how do you feedback to two assessors. So you would need to have the two IQA sheets. If there is an IQ action plan which has been put in place for a particular assessor to say that, okay, this is something which the assessor isn't doing correctly, then in such cases, you would need to evidence, say, two IQA sheets, of two different assessors to say that, this is something which, this is the, so this is how I feedback to the assessor. And when I do the feedback to the assessor, this is the evidence of how the feedback is provided to the assessor. So in the case of NCFE, for example, you have to give feedback to the assessors. In the case of, all such cases, you would need to give feedback to the assessors in any case. And in such instances, you would need to evidence work from two assessors, which is basically the assessments they've done. And on top of it, what you've done is basically given the IQA decisions. So if I just show you my full screen for a second to get that in place, I've got level 3 diploma in health and social care, and I've got another level 3 diploma in health and social care, but there are two different assessors, Daniel and Anjum. And I can see in the case of Daniel, there are some comments here which basically identified any actions. And in the case of Anjum also, there are some comments here which clearly identify, if there are any further actions given to assessors, or if you're not agreeing with the assessor decisions. So you would need to have evidence for these sheets. These are templates which are available, but you'll need to fill them up. And obviously, evidence that, okay, this is how feedback is given to the assessors. And this feedback then allows the assessors to, maintain the quality of the assessment process. And that is how you compare decisions, or assessments done by various assessors in your team. And again, going back to that, you have to have access to two assessors to be able to do this as an activity. And that is where it says compare assessor decision. So sometimes you would find the assessors are being lenient, the decisions they're making are borderline, they're not identifying the assessment criteria clearly, or they are not justifying the reason of achievement of that assessment criteria in the task. Now, in such cases, that would be given out as further action, and you would do a bit of monitoring with that assessor. You might increase the sampling for that assessor from, say, 25% to 50%, and as the remedial action points that you've given, and as it gets embedded in the practice, you would then go back to reducing the sampling again to 25%. But that is where you would need to evidence how do you feedback and compare decisions of two assessors to see whether they are consistent. Now here, you might also look at evidencing how do you run standardization meetings. Now, there is some part of the evidence that you can produce and you can cross-reference across different tasks. So you might not need to write everything in the task, but you might also say that in order to compare decisions and standardize them across a particular cohort or across a particular course, I do conduct a standardization meeting, and those meetings are basically done in a way wherein the assessors are required to assess a particular piece of work. All assessors are given the same piece of work. They're allowed to assess that work. And then there's a discussion which happens to ensure that they are being assessed consistently. They are being judged. The assessment which the assessors are carrying out is reliable, that is fair. And what you do is you standardize the process of sharing with the assessors that how this task needs to be addressed, what are the guidance to look at, what are the criteria to be met, and how do you assess, and then how do you basically mark that particular activity, and then ensure that this activity marked is consistently being done at the same scale or at the same requirement across all the assessors in your team. The next assessment criteria. Sorry, go on.
Raman, I have to leave because I've got a class at 10.
All right, okay, that's fine.
Okay, I'll listen to the recording after it.
No worries.
Thank you.
Now, the next assessment criteria talks about provide assessors with feedback, advice, and support when they need to maintain, and how would you help them? So here is where I would suggest that you would need to go into maybe some of the specific, let's say, document by evidencing one specific document, and that would be the IQA feedback which you provide to the assessor. So sometimes when you carry out the process of, the internal quality assurance, what you also do at some stage is to provide that feedback, to the assessors if they are not meeting a particular, standard. Now, in such cases, again, this is something that you would need to, hypothetically document or look at. But in such cases, what you would generally see is that if I evidence one for you right now, give me 1 second. So in such cases, what you would do is primarily, let's say, evidence how this feedback has been given in detail by you towards the assessor, and how you would allow the assessor to improve in terms of the assessment processes. So if I again share my full screen, which I want to, simply because I need to show this document to you. So in this case, if you look at this email, which was sent across to, say, one of the assessors, and the idea here was that the feedback being provided in the assessment is quite brief. In some cases, the assessment feedback is not conforming, to meeting the guidelines of the assessment. That means, for example, in this image, there is no source being defined, and the assessor has also not picked it up. Now, in some cases, if you see, the assessor is writing a comment, but in some cases, in the commenting, what you would generally see is that the assessment criteria has not been, identified. So in this case, for example, commenting on this was given as a reference to the assessor to say, you need to pick this up, and as an example, show this to the student, that images have to be also referenced. And then in some cases, if the assessment is not being done carefully, then some of the assessment criteria are missing. And what you have to do is ensure that the assessor is able to pick this up. So, for example, in this case, there was a code which was required to be done. The code is provided, but towards the end, when we look at the code being tested, has not been done, by the assessor. So the assessor's comment has been the learning outcome has been achieved. But why has the outcome being achieved has not been defined. So the feedback here to the student should have been that because the task required you to produce a code, the code was then produced. You have evidenced the code. You have to compile the code to say that the program runs well. The compiling part of the function has also been done. And then the third part is to basically interpret the results in terms of the usefulness of that program. Now, that has not been justified here, and only a simple comment that learning outcome has been achieved has been written. So this is not meeting the conformance of the awarding body guidelines in terms of justification of why the evidence, is meeting the criteria, has not been done. So in such cases, what the what the IQA has to do is give feedback to the assessor to say that this is something that you need to follow, and this is how it has to be done. So, for example, some of the bits which were picked up in the assessment process was that it just said ATHE diploma. It should have been level 4 diploma in computing with the unit name, start date, and issue date and end date of the assignment with the registration number. Now, some of the bits in terms of commenting has also been corrected. There are no areas for developmental comment which have been given, and certain parts of the cover sheet have not been filled up. So this was a feedback given to the assessor to say that you are to start looking at, developing this as a practice. And in order to do so, what you have done is you've given detailed feedback by giving advice and guidance in terms of how they can look at improving their own methods of assessment. And in such cases, what you're doing is supporting the assessor in this particular process. And that is an evidence that you would need to put together, for this particular assessment criteria, which is 3.1. The next one talks about, the evidence to say how do you support and standardize your assessment decisions. So here you have to talk about the various activities that you carry out in the IQA role. One of that activity is meetings that you do throughout the year in various organizations. These meetings could be done quarterly, monthly, depending on the size of the cohort and the number of learners involved, and the team that you manage as a team of assessors that you manage. And in some cases, you would need to evidence what is called the standardization meetings. Now, what are standardization meetings? Standardization meetings are done and carried out to ensure that the assessments that are being carried out by the assessors are one, consistent. That means all of them are assessing to the same standard. They are consistent. That when I say that they are fair, that means there are no unfair advantages given to any particular learner, and the assessments are conforming to the given guidelines in the assignment brief and the assessor guidelines given. Then they are reliable. That means the assessments are clearly, detailed. They are doing three things, which is identification of the AC. They are looking at holistic assessments, and they are being justified in terms of the grades being achieved. So these things that you look at in carrying out and discussing during meetings and standardization meeting activities have to be documented here for this particular assessment criteria. How do you apply procedures? So sometimes you have to, let's say, give guidance to the assessors to say, have you looked at the malpractice policy? Has the assignment been scanned to see if the similarity is there? Now, with the revised guidelines coming in from the awarding bodies, you're looking at also having what is called malpractice, but apart from that, AI detection also being included. So you would look at explaining to your assessors and your team to look at how do they interpret the results of the assessments when they look at providing guidance to learners to say, can you go back and paraphrase or rewrite parts of the assignment because they are seeming they are having evidence of plagiarism. In such cases, you look at the process of standardization so that everybody sings from the same songbook. Every assessor applies the same, interprets and applies the same policy in the same way as you would expect them to do so, and that brings in fairness and consistency in the assessment process. So that is what you would need to talk about, in task 3.2. In 4.1 and 4.2, we are talking about the procedures that you follow for recording, storing, and reporting information related to IQA. So here, one of the policies that you would need to reference in both the tasks are going to be the data protection policy. And essentially, in some cases, when we look at EQA reports, the awarding bodies and the institutions sometimes clearly specify how long the records have to be stored. Assessment and IQA records and learner work has to be stored within the organization. Now, these records should be easily stored. They should be easily retrievable for the purposes of inspection, spot checks, and even, for the purposes of archiving. But here, what you need to do is basically talk about that how the records are maintained in the organization, who has access to these records, and last but not the least, when we talk about the access to these records and the storage of these records, how they are essentially stored and retrieved within the organization. So, in a sense, here you would talk about and use the data protection policy. You would talk about uh, let's say, the evidence related to a particular body. Like if I look at Pearson, they expect all such records, which are learner assignments, which are assessment sheets, and also IQA sheets, to be retained in the organization for up to 4 years. Now, this is a document policy with them, and you might need to, reference it by saying that, okay, if I look at the Pearson external quality assurance guidelines, the data requirements and storage requirements are referred to in this section, and according to that, this is something which is implemented within the organization, and that is by clearly specifying as an IQA. What I do is I clearly specify in the program handbook that when we look at the data and records storage and reporting and retrieval, these are guidelines that we need to clearly follow. You could also evidence here, for example, how do you maintain confidentiality? That is where the access rights come in. Who has the access to this information? For example, if it is certifications, only the examination officer or the registrar would have access to the information, apart from when it has been communicated to the learner. One assessment record of one learner is not shared, or the decisions are not shared with the other learners in order to maintain confidentiality. If there are requests which come in externally from the organization, sometimes from employers and other agencies, that can you confirm whether the qualification is being studied by the learner, what was the start date, end date. In such cases, GDPR form needs to be accompanied along with that particular request from the external organization. And in such cases, you would generally see that, until unless you receive that particular, requirement or the GDPR form, there is no way that you are going to essentially provide detailed, response to the concerned, say, a body because of the fact that this is something which is required for you to be able to evidence before you even share that information. So sometimes what you would see is, and I'll give you a clear example, that in order to maintain confidentiality and obviously data protection, what tends to happen is that you would normally receive requests from an external organization which will say, as you can see, can you confirm that this particular person is studied at your institute? And along with that, but when they send this over, they basically send us a scan of the certificate. And also what they do is they give you a data protection form, which basically signed off by the learner to say that, yes, I authorize you or the institution to basically go back and check with the other institution about the qualification and the level at which they have studied and when they have studied. So if these things do not come in as an IQA, the role would be to basically ensure that only the examination officer or the registrar is able to reply, and at the same time what you would also be doing is ensuring that this information is provided for the purposes of verification to that particular requesting party only as against in general. And again, this would be something that you would showcase or evidence in the assessment criteria 4.2. Now, in 5.1, we are talking about applying relevant policies, procedures, to the process of IQA. So here, what we need to be looking at is, when I talk about policies and procedures, there are lots of policies and procedures, but the main policy and procedure that we're looking at is related to legislation. What are the non-default, let's put it this way, what are the areas in which as an organization and an institution where you work in the IQA role, you have to conform to this rule or regulation which is there from the awarding body or the institution. There is no if and but in that. So there are certain documents which are center documents which are provided, or there are guidelines which are provided for you to be able to run that qualification in the center or in that organization, training company, whichever way you put it. They will need to be followed to ensure that you are meeting the quality standards. So here, what you would need to do is reference external quality assurance documents that are used as guidelines, and you bring them into your organization and implement them to suit, I would say, let's say the meeting. Let me rephrase. So here, what I would say is you would need to reference, the external quality assurance documents that you would follow as a guidance document, and then use it within your organization to be able to, let's say, form policies and procedures. And these documents this particular document that you look at, which is for, which is defined as a, let's say, as a document primarily for the purposes of ensuring that all the standards are met, have to be, used to create your own policies and structures. So if I give you an example, what I mean by that is, and just randomly picking up one particular awarding organization. So if I look at Pearson, sticking to the example of Pearson, which I've taken, now there is an external document which they have created for centers to follow. And within the centers, this document would be closely followed by the IQA, Internal Quality Assurer. So it says BTech High National Center Guide for Quality Assurance and Assessment. Now, you as an IQA would be using this guideline as a document and then sharing parts of it with your teams in teaching, in assessing, and obviously if it's a big organization, with teaching assistant and coordinators. So here, if I go into the details of this particular document, this document would specify what would be the requirements a center would need to have or need to follow. And that is, according to them, there is no discussion around that. It is absolutely something which you have to follow. So in such cases, what they do is they provide detailed guidance to say how you need to run the qualification, how do you need to, for example, assess the work, what are the role of IQA, what is the role of the assessors, what is the role of the exam board, the assessment board, the various committees, and it's a very detailed document. Now, what you do as an IQA is you read that document, and from this document, you extract out essential requirements which are non-negotiable. I'll use the word non-negotiable. That means they are processes that you would need to have within your organization to be able to run these. When I say run, I mean offer and teach these qualifications in the center. So these are non-negotiable processes that you have to have in terms of policies and procedures within your organization to be able to run and offer this program to learners. So this particular document defines the relevant policies, procedures, and the legal requirements that you would need to follow as an IQA within the organization. And again, it's a very detailed document. So what you would need to look at is pick out or extract some of the key guidelines which are relevant to you in your role. So for the assessors, it might just be, if I just go back into the index of the document, so there would be some parts of it which are related to, three different teams. There are staff qualifications, handbook, and student. So basically, this document provides guidance on three levels: one for staff who is running the qualification, one for center, and one for the student. So in the staff, you will further break it down into assessors and IQA. And then in the staff, you can also break it down for relation to business and operations, which is recruitment and other bits. So in terms of applying relevant policies, procedures, and legislation, you would now relate this to the policies that we have within our organization. As an example, at UK Versity, so we have a recruitment policy, we have a teaching strategy, we have an IQA policy, we have an assessment policy, we have policies for recruitment, and then teaching and learning strategies and teaching policy. So they would then be relating to our procedures within the organization. Now, how you in your IQA role ensure that these are present and they are implemented, they are used during the course of delivery of this qualification is what you would need to cover, in this particular task. So having a good read of this particular document, as an example, this document or any other awarding body document, they are easily available on Google. You can search them by quality assurance and -EQA. You should be able to get that document. And that is what you would need to write and show here how you follow that particular document and then ensure that they are applied internally within your organization. The last assessment criteria in this particular assignment brief is talking about critical, basically your reflection. It is basically how do you reflect on your role. So this is like a bit of a small reflective essay that you would need to write on your own practice within the, IQA role. So here you need to reflect on how do you carry out what activities you do in your IQA role, how do you keep yourself up to date. The next assessment criteria is, so here you're reflecting on your own practice and activities that you do in the role. Now the next one is talking about how do you maintain the currency of your role. That means how do you keep yourself up to date in the IQA role and the requirements of that role. So here you would need to draw out a table which is like a plan or a career professional development plan or a personal development plan. And here what you would do is document various activities that you carry out, do, or take into account to make sure that you are performing and meeting the requirements given in your job description in your particular role. So you could evidence things like external trainings that you go to, you attend any external meetings, webinars, you undergo any trainings which are done with both internally and externally within the organization, and how do you incorporate best practices by following external awarding body documents related to quality assurance are what you would need to document in the aspect of how do I maintain my currency, which is basically saying how do I maintain my expertise and competence in the IQA role. Is that okay? Any questions on this, particular bit that we are talking about today for the assignment discussion?
There's no question, but it is a lot. I think,
yeah, this assignment is the biggest part of this assignment is the compilation of evidence. And
Yeah,
then once you
it's
have
like
the
a,
evidence, you would be able to write up the verbatim or the documentary summary.
yeah, I think it's going to be quite a task.
Yes. So what I'm going to try and do is maybe provide you some, let's say, sample documents, which hopefully should give you some, I'll try and provide them as templates, and these templates would essentially, allow you to use them and contextualize them for the purposes of, doing your assignment as far as, this is concerned.
That will be very helpful.
Yeah, so that is what I will try and do, and I'll upload on Moodle so that you have at least some of these documents that you can refer to or extracts bits of it to be able to put together, for the purposes of using it as annexures in your assignment. But this assignment, and no, please don't be under any, let's say fallacy that is something that you can do quite quickly. It will require 100%, the evidence to be, created. And obviously, without the evidence being created, it will not meet the requirements of, undergoing certification.
Yeah, I was about to say the same thing. I think turning this thing in 2 weeks is like looking a
Well,
Herculean task, actually.
no, I would say if you are able to put together the, let's say the, let's say the, for example, um, the templates together, what are required for you to be able to cover, then it will become a bit easier. But if you're not able to collect the documents, then I think it will become a Herculean task. So the first thing that I would suggest, if anybody is doing this particular assignment, is primarily looking at getting together the evidence in place, what all you would need and how you would put that together is something that you would need to, do it. So get together in terms of gathering the evidence.
Got it.
Okay, so this is the bit which I've started to upload on Moodle. And what I would do is just quickly show you so that, you're able to see that these are documents which are, which I'm showing. Anything that I've shown today, what I've done is I'm going to try and put it here so that you have access to it. And, that would allow you to. So in your case, for example, I would say first and foremost, get hold of two learners' work, and then get hold of two assessors, even if you have to make them up in terms of having the assessors, get that in place, and then look at some of these templates that I'm providing, and they would then be extracts that you would use to be able to I would say put together for the purposes of putting the evidence together. So I'll put here a bit of a label to say assignment discussion session. So this bit here, I'm going to try and put there we go. So this would essentially be, the bits that you start looking at, various documents and other bits that I would say you would start looking at from a point of view of, using it. So, for example, I'm going to put some IQA sheets as well, some front cover sheets as well for different organizations, and they would hopefully be useful from a point of view of, filling up or usage from a point of view of, using as templates. So there are lots of documents, but you might not need to reference all the documents. But at the end of the day, these documents would be, useful for you to look at because they will give you some ideas, and that should allow you to essentially, use them for the purposes of, doing your assignment. Is that okay? Good stuff. So I'll catch up with you, hopefully in the next week or so. And then if you have any questions or if you do feel that you get stuck anywhere, then do drop me an email. And what I will do is come back and obviously email specifically to you the required document so that you are able to use it for the purposes of creating your evidence.
Thanks a lot. Thank you.
Okay, good stuff.